Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Crimes and Times. We have a great show lined up tonight. During my 27 years of law enforcement, I always felt there's no crime could be any worse than something I've seen before. I can never be any more shocked than something I haven't seen before, but somehow I always am. Tonight, we're going to talk about a crime that is so insidious, it's going to shock the conscience. Because not only is it being committed by violent criminal gangs or criminal syndicates, but it's aided and abetted by those of us in the community. The guy next door, people look innocent. If it wasn't for them, this crime could not exist. Let's take a quick look at a video and then be joined by our two guests.
From the outside, it's a gorgeous $1 million mansion. On the inside, police say, a house of horrors.
I was stunned because I thought, here I am. And all my life, I didn't even know this was here.
8 women were held captive in this Georgia suburban home, investigators say, in a horrific case of human trafficking.
I'm in a very bad situation and I need to get out.
This is the beginning of the 911 call from one of the women inside. It helped them escape.
Wait, did you say you're in a house full of girls?
Mm-hmm.
And somebody threatened to kill you if you leave?
Mm-hmm.
Who's threatening to kill you? One of the girls?
No, our boss.
The boss, detectives say, is this man, 33-year-old Kendrick Roberts, who now faces charges of false imprisonment and human trafficking. According to prosecutors, the women met Roberts through a website called Seeking Arrangement.
These women were basically lured there with a promise of either financial help or a modeling career or some kind of career advancement.
Neighbors can't believe they missed the warning signs.
It just goes to show that this kind of thing can be happening anywhere around us, even right next door.
For InsideEdition.com, I'm Lee Sheps.
Okay, and we thank Inside Edition for that clip. We're going to turn to our first guest, Dottie Laster. Dottie is the executive director of the Heidi Search Center, and she's a subject matter on human trafficking. She's also a national hero, being responsible for the recovery of many young girls. Dottie, thank you for joining us today.
Well, thanks for having me. It's so good to be here.
Were you able to see and hear the video that we played?
I did not.
Okay.
But I can bet I've seen it before.
I know, yeah. I had a feeling I could tell you weren't able to see it on your end. Basically, it was a video about a house in Atlanta, Georgia, where young girls were lured there by promises of careers in modeling as such and became captive to the sex trafficking trade. General opinion, what do you know about this? How does that strike you, hearing that story again?
Well, unfortunately, it's one I hear every day, and it's not on film. It's in our towns, our cities. It's real moms and dads calling me for help. And it's a story that's repeated much more than anyone could ever imagine.
And let's talk about the victimology of these girls. You know, we know about folklore, what we see, what we think we know, and we do hear these stories, just these, lures of modeling a career or something else. But who are these girls that you've rescued? Meaning, how did they get lured into that trap? And is there something similar in their backgrounds or their lives that made them vulnerable to being lured in?
Well, the real scary thing is, one thing I've learned is trafficking does not discriminate at all. Doesn't discriminate on age, gender, socioeconomic status, geography. It has no preference. And the scary thing is, it can be anybody. And I don't say that lightly. I have started working the last 2 years in missing persons, thinking maybe I'd get a little away from the trafficking after 14 years. And what I found is I got heavier into it, more than I'd ever done before. And it was U.S. citizen, high school and college kids. They're literally being harvested from their parents' home at 3 a.m. with mom and dad sleeping in the next room, or they're going to school and being picked up at school, and no one knows they're gone till the end of the day. It's every parent's worst nightmare.
Really? So it's just a kidnap, sort of by force taking of these individuals and the disappear into the underground of the sex trafficking?
No, it's more insidious than that, because we get, if a person's kidnapped, we get the full response of everybody from the community, law enforcement, everything we need, from helicopters to dogs, would be dispatched. But what happens is they're meeting people online through all these internet applications that parents have never had to deal with before. We have all these apps that have dissolving messages, 24/7 access to our children. When mom or dad finds something inappropriate on the phone and takes it away, that's what the bad guy wants. That is awesome, because then he'll get a phone to her that no one knows she has, and then he has unfettered access. And I have worked so many cases where literally both parents of a straight A student involved in church and athletics goes to bed in the middle of the night, mom and dad hear something, they walk in her room and she's gone. And
Interesting.
It'll take us a hunt like you've never imagined to find her, and sure enough, she'll be on Backpage being sold, or in a motel somewhere, or in your worst horrible situation that you could imagine. And they don't come back, the 12, 13, 14, 20-year-old that left. They come back really damaged.
Right, I would imagine. When you capture when an individual, let's say we call it John, goes there, I mean, there is no mistake in there where they can see that these girls are being held against their will, right? I mean, there's no chance they can say, I didn't realize this. I thought I was, hooking up with a consenting adult, into just, prostitution. And not to minimize the fact, there's a crime, but there's a difference there. I mean, is there any way any of these Johns or these facilitators could say, I didn't know, or is it just so painfully obvious?
Well, in my experience, the Johns know more. Like, I learned a lot by, finding people who bought sex and talking to them to try to learn in my early years. And yeah, they knew. Let me give you an example of how messed up people get when they're buying sex. And I put a hashtag out there every time I see these stories. I give a hashtag commercial sex is barbaric, because it is. I hope there's a day soon, before I pass on, where we do away with buying porn, stripping, and prostitution, because it's barbaric. There's a brothel, and it was nothing but a brothel. It wasn't like a sports bar or a cantina. It was just a brothel in Houston. And through a long series of events, we got it closed, and we got an abolitionist group to lease it. And a year after they had leased it, I was there shooting a film for MSNBC. And so we were on break. We were sitting there just, powered down way in the back of the room. Well, in the building, there was multiple rooms. And while I was there for about 2 hours, 3 Johns walked in the door. Clearly had changed. It has a big sign that says what it is now. Lights, doors that it didn't have before. And he walks all the way to the back room, which he must have gone through 5 or 6 rooms, looking for sex. And so when people are going to buy sex, they're not worried about the signs they're seeing or if she's willing or not. They are so hyped up on their high of choice that example I saw really brought it home to me. I couldn't believe that many men a year later were still walking through that door, oblivious to the signs that it was no longer a brothel. In fact, quite the opposite. It was an abolitionist group trying to shut down the brothels, and was not hindered by our cameras, by my 6'8" bodyguard, by nothing. He was just darn sure we had some women there for him.
Unbelievable. And I'm going to want to get back to the enforcement against these people. Stand by, Dottie. Let's go to our next guest, Marcel van der Watt. Marcel is a former South African police officer who is joining us tonight from South Africa. Marcel, what time is it there?
Good evening, Michael, and good evening to Dottie and the viewers. It's around about 3 a.m.
Well, I just want to point that out to everybody, though I knew the answer, but thank you so much for your dedication of getting up this time of the night to join us and bring us your expertise. So, Marcel, you heard, what Dottie had to say, the clip. In general, what is your opinion? How do you see the problem in South Africa, which we know is a global problem? And in a minute after you speak, we're going to show just a little graphic, everybody, to kind of show them just what the problem is. But what's your overview based on the conversation, Marcel?
Sure. well, I think South Africa definitely presents a microcosm of what human trafficking really has to offer. We all know sex trafficking is definitely the most documented type of trafficking here in South Africa and locally. However, we have from sex trafficking, labor trafficking, domestic servitude, organ trafficking. The elements of the crime, Michael, remains pretty much the same. However, the manner in which it manifests it clearly presents multi-layered scenarios. But once again, absolute reality. And, I can definitely see from my experience how our local context or our local situation really fits beautifully into the international picture. So global crime definitely interconnected.
Incredible. We have a question here on, is human trafficking more common in the U.S. or Europe? Darren, if we could show that little video there, not the video, I'm sorry, just the graphic we have, just a little map there. And our speakers probably won't get to see this, but let's show that to the audience. We'll bring that up there. And if everyone's seeing that, it just shows you the magnitude of the problem. Millions and over 20 million people suspected of being in the sex trade by force, the money involved, and the criminal syndicate there all over the world. So to you, Marcel, the question is human trafficking more common, do you think, in Europe and Africa than the United States? Or do you get the concept it's just a worldwide problem?
Well, Michael, that's one of the key questions that researchers pretty much been struggling with for the last, at very least for the last 15 years is, what is the scope, the nature and the extent of human trafficking? And I think a lot of the statistics that we are seeing, and if you see, the different researchers and organizations doing the research, you often find a discrepancy between what these estimations are, and it's pretty much because we are dealing with a subversive crime. We are dealing with a hidden crime, and people, people in the sex trade, persons in prostitution, those committing the crimes, they are effectively hidden populations. So it's really difficult to get an accurate grasp of how significant the problem is. I always refer to the common denominator in all of these cases really is a position of vulnerability, and I think as Dottie wonderfully pointed out, is that, anybody can really be a victim of this crime. Obviously there are geographic, social, structural differences between the US and South Africa. And, we do see, a lot of vulnerable communities in South Africa and obviously in the broader Africa. So vulnerability is definitely a centerpiece of what the South African narrative has to offer. Whether there are more trafficking happen, most probably, theoretically, that could be argued. However, in practice, we don't have the statistics, but most definitely a problem.
Right, very interesting. And Marcel, you and I spoke earlier this week, and you discussed more the porous borders you have there. South Africa, much more difficult than here. Much easier to penetrate than here in the United States. Some subject to more terrorism trafficking, such as through Boko Haram. So I want to pose a question first to Marcel and then to Dottie, a question that came in here. They're asking if it's true that they hear the stories of families in Eastern Europe actually selling their daughters into the sex trade. First to you, Marcel, have you seen signs of families willingly selling their daughters into the sex trade?
Definitely, Michael. Sadly, to say, to give you an affirmative response. Once again, scope, nature, and extent of that phenomena where families actually sell their daughters, not known, but there's most definitely, a complicity by communities, often by families, once again, underpinned by, by economic factors, social and structural inequalities. But definitely, locally, we also have cultural related practices, which really fits beautifully within the ambit and definition of forced marriages. Yes, where syndicates are definitely in a process of not only grooming victims, but also grooming families and also grooming, I would say, neighborhoods and communities in funneling victims into a specific enterprise. So complicity by families, unfortunately, yes.
Wow, which makes your skin crawl. Dottie, in your experience of the girls you've rescued, have you found girls from Eastern Europe or Africa or any of the other continents or nations that you believe were sold willingly into the sex trade by their families?
Yeah, I found foreign immigrant victims that were sold by families, mothers, fathers, brothers, uncles. But more often, I found U.S. citizens sold by U.S. citizen parents. So I
Really?
want everyone to know it's not just something somewhere else. Wherever you live, here is here. It's happening here.
Now, Dottie, these girls who come from these other continents or countries, how did they get in? How did they get smuggled in the country? Literally through the southern border, where they brought in under a ruse with phony documents. How'd they get here, or do we ever find out?
Well, some of them weren't abused until they got here. They came here legally, and then the trick was to get them here. So they didn't come illegally. They came with documents and visas. Some of them were smuggled. Some of them, like I said, are U.S. citizens that are already here. In fact, that's the majority of what I see is U.S. citizens trading rent or drugs for sex with their daughter or just outright selling them. So any way someone can create a way to exploit someone, I've probably seen it. As you said in the beginning, you think I've seen it all. No, come up with a new one.
Something new.
Luckily it's getting less and less, but they still come.
As I talk to you guys, I just keep thinking about things I didn't even consider. Questions are still coming in from the audience, which is good. Let's start with Dottie on this one. They want to know, is the dark web really used to sell people? Dottie, what's been your experience on that?
Yes. Any place you can have someone that feels untraceable. And remember, trafficking is porn, prostitution, and stripping. It's as well as forced labor. I worked on a baby selling case here in San Antonio about 6 months ago. We got that baby back, but it was a newborn. It was less than a month old. And you know the challenge it is to find a baby that, you know how we change, we're born as little pink wrinkly things, and we change dramatically day by day. We were really lucky to get that one back.
And this, Marcel, what about you? Have you found the dark web to be a place where people have sold individuals into the sex trade, or any of the human trafficking that you've discussed, labor, organ trafficking, any of the underground trafficking webs?
Yeah. Well, there's increasing realization of the dark web and what's really actually happening on there. On social media, absolutely. Sites where goods are being bought and sold. We've had, instances of children actually being advertised on there by a parent or by even by a significant other of a mother and a child. But the dark web, we've definitely had child pornography rings where we are increasingly finding that these guys are using live streaming to at least sell the services, quote unquote services, loosely used the term. So obviously, as Dottie also referred to, the anonymity that goes along with using the internet, using the dark web, we are definitely seeing a shift towards the benefits. I mean, we always talk about the vice and the value of technology, and the dark web is definitely one of those. However, I do not know of any active cases where we've drawn a direct nexus between the dark web and human trafficking. But is it actually happening? I mean, I can almost assure you that it is happening.
Okay, let's talk about saving these girls. Marcel, as a police officer, former police officer, tell us, how did you in South Africa go after human traffickers?
Mm-hmm. I think once again, coming back to the local context in South Africa, the issue of prostitution effectively is criminalized in South Africa, but it's not being properly policed, either reactively or proactively. So a lot of the victims that are probably the most easily identified are those in the sex trade, those on the streets where a neighbor, where the community has seen or identified something that's obviously not right, and has then called in, and called law enforcement to respond to the situation. And I think the best type of evidence, I mean, that we can generate is usually intelligence-led investigations where we do need to go undercover and kind of infiltrate these syndicates, which then really, helps identify, probably gives you a more accurate scope of the extent to which trafficking is happening in a syndicate. But mostly informants, whistleblowers, um, irregularities at the border controls. We also have identification teams at our international ports of entry, especially at our main airport, where you actively have, and these are NGOs assisting law enforcement officials to identify unassuming victims coming in, where people has been offered a job. Their paperwork aren't even in order, and they are then posed the key questions at their ports of entries, and you realize that this person is most probably on their way to be exploited and trafficked. So once again, it remains a hidden subversive crime, but especially where there's a knowledge and awareness about the issue, people do identify and people do report.
Very interesting. And you're talking mostly, again, about good heads-up police work, but more reactive than proactive. Now, Dottie, I'm sure you're familiar now with the FBI. When I was in there, we had these very active, I'm sure we still do, you see them on TV, these undercover operations trying to capture people looking to connect with underage girls and similar matters. What have you seen in law enforcement here that has been more successful than other tactics in finding and discovering these underground sex trafficking networks?
Well, the sheriff that I work here in Bexar County, which is the county that San Antonio is in, he has treated missing kids as urgent crime investigations, where a lot of the police departments treat all the missing cases as more of a civil matter. And so treating that as an urgent matter right away, we've worked together very successfully and rescued quite a few. And I think that's a shift in law enforcement that I hope to see replicated often, to where when a person even goes missing, it's usually more often than not due to the worst crimes in our society, whether it's murder, domestic violence, sex trafficking, labor trafficking, they have a medical malfunction or even, some sort of accident. But if you see it normally in most departments, it's treated as a very low end on the crime scale. And yet when you do find the victim, you find they were usually victims of some of our worst crimes that we could imagine.
Right, I would imagine that. Now, without giving away any secrets for law enforcement, are you aware on the local level of very aggressive law enforcement, such as monitoring the web, monitoring the dark web, undercover operations, and similar proactive matters that try to identify these networks very early on?
Well, I found that the best way that I'm helpful, I don't know what goes on, behind law enforcement unless they tell me, but where I've been the most helpful is to connect with intelligence officers. Because a lot of times I have a huge amount of information, but for a lot of reasons, there may not be an investigation, there may not be a prosecution. We may not either have the victim yet, or we may get them, and for some reason, law enforcement doesn't move forward, or the victim doesn't want to move forward. So you can see getting a case to a full investigation has a lot of barriers. And so no matter what, I share my information with intelligence officers, and I don't wait to see if we're going to investigate. I get it in there right away. And that has resulted in further investigations either later or enhanced information that pops up, while we're working the case. Maybe they connect some dots. And I think that's the best way any civilian could be able to move this forward, is get in touch with your intelligence officers. They're able to receive information much more freely than a law enforcement officer that's worried about not just solving a crime and protecting a victim, but getting it to the prosecutor and into a courtroom.
Okay, I have a couple questions I want to pose to both of you that I have, and questions are coming in from the audience pretty regularly here. Let's compare and contrast. Marcel, in South Africa, if this was a lecture to citizens, you would say what to tell them how to spot the signs of human trafficking. For example, here in the United States, I think Dottie and I would say, look at sporting events, big events where you have large crowds of men. What would you say would be kind of the clues someone should look for that might indicate sex trafficking going on, at least in the open or partially in the open? What are the red flags?
Yeah, well, I think there's almost countless issues that could be identified. I think, just to mention some of them, just the unfamiliarity with his or her surroundings. We speak about linguistic isolation, where a person that you identify, you try to strike a conversation with, is unable to communicate effectively, in a much used language. We often find, especially in the sex trade also, when when questions are being posed to a person, where the pimp would just jump in and answer on behalf of the person that you're trying to interview. And then also just where these activities occur. You often have cars and visitors 24 hours throughout the day, visiting, stopping for short periods of time, between 30 minutes and maximum an hour and a half. There's a constant, walking and movement at a specific address. We also find with pimps and traffickers that they are very sophisticated in their counter surveillance and their counter intelligence strategy. So you might have a place known to be a brothel, and you actually have these guys doing their beat and walking up and down, actually following suspicious vehicles to see whether this could be a possible ongoing police investigation. And then it's intimately intersects and intertwined with a drug trade. I often argue that the sex trade really is the front shop or the front end of an enormous drug trade. So where trafficking, obviously more specifically sex trafficking, is happening, it's always intertwined with a host of other crimes, amongst others, drugs, petty crimes, and the rest.
Right. As you were speaking, Marcel, I was thinking two things. One, that video we show in the beginning of this quiet house in Atlanta. I bet if we had a videotape of that house 24/7, we would see some of those signs that you're talking about that people may have just shrugged off. And the other thing you brought up was, as you were describing the coming and going, I'm thinking of, it reminds me of my days on the narcotics task force back in New York. That's exactly what these places look like. Dottie, going to you, again, we think about Super Bowl and these major events. What would you tell the public to look for to see if we could identify what we might believe is sex trafficking?
Well, the first thing I tell everyone is that any minor in commercial sex is a victim. It doesn't matter if there is any force, fraud, or coercion. So stripping, pornography, or prostitution, anyone under 18, not 17 and a half, not any of that, but under 18 is a victim. You don't need to show anything else.
That's nationwide in every state? That's every state?
Yes, that's federally, so that's all 50 states. And then most states have a local law as well, and they tend to match our federal law. So each state's different, but I would say that your odds are pretty good. Every state's going to be under 18, and if that doesn't work federally, it's under 18. So there is no excuse to have a minor in your brothel or pornography.
Right, so we go out there, I mean, if you see a man with a young girl and it just doesn't look like he's out with his daughter, he's not taking her into the ball game, he's not taking her into the park, he's not taking her, doing things. Look at some of the behavior that Marcel talked about there, the inability to communicate. We could put this together for a picture that at least someone should call the police, right? At least, don't approach them on your own, but at least make that call. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, if you can safely snap a photo or get a license plate, that helps so much. And as I said, the intelligence officers are great. So like FBI.gov and ICE.gov have ways you can tip. If you can send tips into their website. You can also call your local law enforcement and ask how you could get this information to them. I like it if you could call a patrol officer and ask him to take a report and say in the report you think it's human trafficking. Just getting that language in there will get it bumped up to the right detective. So you can be very proactive as a citizen.
Very good point. So if we suspect human trafficking, use that terminology so the police dispatcher or whomever understands the severity and the need to get out there quickly.
Yes. And then also if it, there may be a step 2, getting it to a detective, it'll route it to the right person that understands and is trained in the issue.
All right. The next question I have here, let's start with Dottie, then we'll go to Marcel. Someone wants to know, do these sex traffickers really do get girls hooked up on drugs, or is that more folklore? What has been your experience, Dottie? Do they use drug addiction as a way to control them?
Well, certainly anyone's drug addiction makes them vulnerable to this. The victims I've been fortunate enough to work with, they may have been drugged while they were trafficked to get through the sex acts, but I haven't found that I've had to work with drug addicted victims, and that really helps. It makes it much easier to help them, recover if they're not of an addict type personality. So it's really sad to see someone who isn't an addict be given these horrible drugs and to see them withdraw and come off of it. But they tend to do pretty well with that part. Now, if someone is opening themselves up to that addiction, especially if they have children around them, I would say drugs and children don't mix. If you're doing drugs and you've got kids, your kid's going to be exploited, and probably you are too.
Great point. Marcel, to you. I'm sorry, did I cut you off, Dottie?
No, I was just going to say it's like physics, like gravity. It just works that way. So children, they really don't need to be around anyone doing drugs because it's going to work out in their exploitation.
Good education going on here today. I hope people are listening. Marcel, in your experience, have sex traffickers used drugs to hook girls for the purpose of controlling them?
Absolutely, all the time, Michael, all the time. And I think that is what makes, I've often spoken about drugs as almost the glue that keeps this enterprise going, especially in the local context. And, we are struggling significantly with West African organized crime syndicates who's intimately involved in the drug trade as well. So drugs, absolutely. And I think what is great about our legislation, there's one section in our legislation which speaks to the issue of the abuse of a position of vulnerability as a means through which human trafficking are being perpetrated. And then within the first chapter of the Act, it deconstructs what it means by the abuse of a position of vulnerability. And those include social circumstances, financial circumstances. Drug addiction is one of the positions of vulnerability that's actually being exploited by traffickers. So it's very common for an addiction, and often, for these women to be starved from drugs, either as a punitive measure or as a means to induce further manipulation and coercion. So drugs is an essential element in, I would say, the overwhelming majority of sex trafficking cases.
Interesting. I have one last question for you, Marcel, and then one last question for you, Dottie. Marcel, I didn't get to ask, in the girls that you have rescued in South Africa, did you ever have girls who have been trafficked there from the United States?
I can honestly say, Michael, I have, we've had people in the sex trade doing stripping and other types of sexual quote-unquote services, where I have come across ladies from the US, in the absolute minority, however, but trafficking victims, human trafficking victims in South Africa from the US, I've personally not came across any of those.
Okay. And Dottie, for you, since you're here in the U.S., someone's asking, is there a certain charity or charities you recommend people donate to specifically to help fight sex trafficking or help the victims of sex trafficking?
Well, I'm partial to the two that I work with, the Heidi Search Center.org, O-R-G, and the Bernardo, B-E-R-N-A-R-D-O, Kohler, K-O-H-L-E-R Center. And it's at bernardokohler.org. And one of them does immigration law and works with abused, abandoned, and neglected children. And then the Heidi Search Center, we help find missing and exploited children and adults.
Give the address for the first one. I think I talked over you. The first one you said?
Okay. It's THEV Heidi Search Center.org.
Okay, of which you're the executive director, and as I said, we both know all the work you have done on behalf of rescuing girls. I want to thank both my guests for coming on. Thank you for the good fighting, the good fight. All of us in the United States and around the world appreciate it. Marcel, thank you for getting up this strange hour of the night, but I know your dedication to this, and I appreciate it, and we'll be in touch. Dottie, we've been social media friends for a while. Great to finally meet you. I want to thank you both for your time.
Well, thank you. I appreciate Marcel. It's an honor to be on the same show with both of you. And I hope you'll follow all of us on Facebook or DottieLaster.org or Instagram, wherever you are, follow us because numbers help.
All right, thank you. Good night, guys. Thank you, Marcel.
Right. Thanks,
Bye.
guys. Bye-bye.
Well, folks, I think we had an unusually educational evening tonight, and I want to thank you for listening. I think the important message to take here is the fact that we are not helpless against this insidious crime. As Dottie mentioned, as Marcel mentioned, keep your eyes open. Look for that unusual behavior. There are always red flags that we see. Trafficking, in terms of people coming and going, cars coming and going, odd hours of the night, very quick stops, just unusual for its location. Young girls who don't appear to belong there, not part of a family. Look for them at ball games, older men with younger girls that, again, look suspicious. I'm not talking about just any situation like that. Something that truly looks suspicious, where the girl just does not appear to be there on her own free will, cannot look someone in the eye. Look for all those. If you suspect human trafficking, call your local police department. As Dottie said, use those words so they understand the serious nature of what you're saying. Get an officer out there quickly. Try to remember description of the man, of the girl, and get a license plate. I can tell you from my years in law enforcement, the license plate is one of the greatest leads we can have. So I want to thank you for your time. Thank you for watching Crimes and Times. That's my take, and I'll see you next week.